The old Victorian house on Oakwood Lane had stood for well over a century, its faded blue paint and weathered shutters telling stories of generations past. Thomas had owned it for barely 3 months, but from the moment he first stepped foot on the property, he felt oddly at home despite the clear neglect. The previous owners had let everything fall apart over the last decade. The gutters sagged, the porch creaked dangerously, and the backyard had grown wild, almost feral in its abandonment. "It's got good bones," the real estate agent had told him, a phrase Thomas found both comforting and slightly unsettling. But the price had been right, and something about the old place called to him. Perhaps it was the way morning light filtered through the stained glass window above the staircase, casting colorful shadows across the worn hardwood floors. Or maybe it was simply the quiet of the neighborhood, a welcome change from his cramped, downtown apartment. The first 2 months had been consumed with interior work, fixing leaky pipes, patching holes in the plaster walls, and updating the ancient electrical system that threatened to catch fire every time he plugged in his toaster. But as summer gave way to early autumn, Thomas turned his attention to the jungle that was supposed to be his backyard. "You couldn't pay me to tackle that mess," his friend Chen had said during a visit, beer in hand, as they surveyed the overgrown lot from the relative safety of the back porch. "There could be anything living in there. Raccoons, possums, maybe even old man Jenkins from down the street who went missing last spring." He'd laughed, but Thomas had only smiled weakly in response. The truth was, Thomas needed a project to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. The divorce had been finalized. Just before he bought the house, and idle time led to unwelcome thoughts about what might have been. So early on a Saturday morning in October, armed with work gloves, pruning shears, and a shovel, Thomas waded into the sea of weeds that in some places reached well above his head. The work was therapeutic. There was something deeply satisfying about cutting back the chaos, revealing the true shape of the land beneath. By midday, he had cleared a significant section along the back fence, uncovering what might have once been a garden bed. It was there he decided he would build a small workshop, somewhere to pursue the woodworking hobby he'd abandoned years ago when life and work had gotten too busy. Thomas wiped sweat from his brow and took a long drink from his water bottle. The autumn air held a slight chill, but the physical labor had him working in just a t-shirt despite the temperature. He stuck his shovel into what seemed like a promising spot to start marking out the workshop foundation. The shovel hit something, solid with a dull thud. "Great," Thomas muttered to himself. "Probably a tree root." The old oak that dominated the corner of the yard had likely spread its roots throughout the entire property over the decades. He shifted position and tried again, only to be met with the same resistance. Curious now, Thomas began to clear away more of the surrounding soil. What he uncovered wasn't a root, but something smooth and flat, too uniform to be a natural formation. Thomas got down on his knees, using his hands to brush away more dirt. As he cleared more of the object, his breath caught in his throat. It was concrete, roughly rectangular, about the size of a large serving platter. And there were markings on it, not random scratches but deliberate engravings, though decades of soil and moisture had made them difficult to decipher. A chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the October breeze. He'd uncovered what appeared to be a small headstone. "This can't be right," Thomas said aloud, his voice sounding strange in the empty yard. He stood up quickly, taking a few steps back as if the concrete slab might somehow reach out and grab him. Houses this old often had strange histories, he reminded himself. Maybe it was just a marker for a beloved family pet. That would make sense. People buried their dogs and cats in the backyard all the time, especially a century ago. Nothing odd about that. But deep down, Thomas knew he was trying to convince himself of something he didn't believe. The size of the marker was too large for a pet, and there was something about the placement, tucked away in this back corner, now hidden by years of neglect, that felt deliberate. As if someone had wanted it forgotten. Thomas glanced toward his house, suddenly aware of how the upper windows seemed to be watching him, the glass reflecting the cloudy sky in a way that made them look like blank, staring eyes. He shivered and turned back to his discovery. Curiosity overcame his initial unease. Thomas retrieved his shovel and began to carefully clear the area around the concrete slab. As more dirt was moved aside, he could see that the slab was indeed covering something. The earth around it had settled differently, creating a subtle, rectangular depression. By late afternoon, Thomas had exposed the full perimeter of what was unmistakably a small grave. The concrete marker sat at one end, its engraving still too worn to read clearly. The grave itself was small. Too small, for an adult, which only made the discovery more unsettling. Thomas sat back on his heels, uncertain what to do next. The responsible thing would be to call someone, the police maybe, or the historical society, but something held him back. There would be questions, investigations. His peaceful new beginning would be disrupted, possibly for months. And what if they found something that implicated the previous owners? Or worse, what if it somehow affected his ownership of the property? These were selfish thoughts, Thomas knew, but they were also practical ones. He needed more information before he involved authorities. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Thomas realized he'd been kneeling by the grave for nearly an hour, lost in thought. The temperature was dropping rapidly now that daylight was fading, and goosebumps rose on his arms. Tomorrow, he said to himself, standing up stiffly. I'll figure this out tomorrow. That night, Thomas barely slept. He tossed and turned, his mind racing with possibilities. Who was buried in his backyard? Why wasn't it in a proper cemetery? And why had no one mentioned it when he bought the house? When he did manage to drift off, his dreams were troubled. He saw himself digging deeper and deeper, the hole somehow never reaching its end. From somewhere far below, he could hear a child's laughter, faint but growing louder as he continued to dig. Thomas awoke with a start at 3:17 a.m., his heart pounding. The dream had felt so real that for a moment, he wasn't sure if he was truly awake. Outside his window, the moon cast long shadows across his backyard, and the spot where he'd uncovered the grave seemed darker than the surrounding area, as if the night itself was pooling there. He didn't return to sleep. Instead, as first, light crept into the sky, Thomas found himself at the local library waiting for it to open. The elderly librarian raised an eyebrow at his disheveled appearance but directed him to the local history section without comment. For hours, Thomas pored over old property records, newspaper archives, and county histories. He learned that his house had been built in 1897 by a family called the Blackwoods, who had owned it until the mid-1950s. They had been prominent in the community, the father a banker, the mother active in local charities. They'd had 3 children according to the census records. What Thomas couldn't find was any mention of a burial plot on the property, no record of a death that might explain the small grave in his backyard. No mention of tragedy or scandal associated with the Blackwood family. By the time he returned home that afternoon, Thomas had convinced himself that further investigation was necessary. Not just out of curiosity now, but out of a sense of responsibility. If someone was buried on his property, didn't he owe it to them to at least know who they were? As the sun began to set for the second time since his discovery, Thomas stood at the edge of the gravesite, shovel in hand. The right thing would be to report this, to let professionals handle whatever came next. Instead, he began to dig. For 3 days, Thomas told no one about what he'd found. Not his friend Chen, who called twice to check how the yard cleanup was going. Not his sister during their weekly Sunday phone call. Not even the friendly mail carrier who commented on the growing pile of dirt visible from the side gate. Doing some landscaping? She'd asked, handing him a bundle of envelopes and flyers. Something like that, Thomas had replied, trying to sound casual despite the dirt under his fingernails and the lack of sleep evident in the dark circles beneath his eyes. The truth was, Thomas had barely slept since beginning his excavation. Every night he'd work until his arms ached and his back screamed in protest, then shower off the dirt and collapse into bed, only to lie awake for hours. When sleep finally came, it brought vivid dreams, always of digging, always with that distant sound of childlike laughter growing closer. During daylight hours, Thomas continued his research. He'd taken photos of the concrete marker with his phone and, after hours of careful cleaning with a soft brush, had managed to make out some of the faded engravings, what appeared to be initials, LB, and the partial date 1903. The third digit had been worn away completely. LB, Thomas muttered to himself as he scrolled through more digitized newspaper archives at the library. LB. Lawrence Blackwood? Louise Blackwood? According to census records, the Blackwoods had 3 children. Henry, born in 1898, William, born in 1900, and a daughter, Lillian, born in 1907. None had the initials LB. Unless Lillian had married someone whose last name began with B. Thomas dug deeper, requesting additional records from the librarian, an older woman named Ruth, who had begun to recognize him during his daily visits. "Quite the history buff, aren't you?" she'd commented that morning, setting down a stack of ledgers from the county clerk's office. "Most people who move into the old houses around here just want to know about architectural details, not family histories." Thomas had managed a tight smile. "Just curious about who lived there before me." Ruth had given him an appraising look over her reading glasses. The Blackwoods were well respected, but people said they kept to themselves, especially after. She trailed off, then shook her head. "Well, every old house has its stories." "After what?" Thomas had pressed, but Ruth had already moved away to help another patron. Now, as the afternoon sun slanted through the library's tall windows, Thomas finally found something. In a barely legible entry from a church registry dated 1911, there was a record of a baptism. Lucy Blackwood, born to Henry Blackwood and his wife, Eleanor. Henry would have been only 13 years old, which seemed impossible. Thomas reread the entry several times, certain he must be misinterpreting something. On the following page, dated just 3 months later, was a death record. Lucy Blackwood, aged 12 weeks, cause of death, fever. Thomas sat back in his chair, a mixture of sadness and confusion washing over him. If Lucy had died in 1911, that didn't match the 1903 date on the marker. And why would she be buried in the backyard rather than the church cemetery? Unless... He flipped through more pages, scanning each entry carefully. And there it was, in a registry from 1923. Another Lucy Blackwood, born to Henry Blackwood and Eleanor. They had named a second daughter after their first. There was no corresponding death record for this Lucy in the church registry. But the O, dated 1923, matched what could have been engraved on the marker in his yard. By the time Thomas left the library, the sun had already set. The streets were quiet as he drove home, his mind racing with possibilities. Had something happened to the second Lucy? Something the family wanted to keep quiet? Was that why she was buried on the property instead of the church cemetery? The house seemed to loom larger than usual as Thomas pulled into the driveway. The upstairs windows reflected the moonlight, giving them that same watching quality he'd noticed before. For a moment he sat in his car, reluctant to go inside. "This is ridiculous," he said aloud, forcing himself to grab his research notes and head up the front steps. It's just an old house, just a sad story from 100 years ago. But as he entered the dark foyer, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that the house itself was somehow aware of him, aware of what he knew and what he planned to do. That night, Thomas made a decision. He would finish excavating the grave. He needed to know for certain what was buried there. If it was indeed the remains of a child, he would contact the authorities immediately. But something told him there was more to this story, something the Blackwood family had wanted to keep hidden. Under the cover of darkness, Thomas returned to the backyard with better tools. A more refined set of brushes he'd purchased from an art supply store, work lights he'd set up on stands, and a new, smaller shovel that allowed for more precise digging. The gravesite looked different in the harsh artificial light, somehow both more real and more surreal. The rectangular depression was now a distinct hole about 3 feet deep, with the concrete marker carefully set aside. Thomas had been working methodically, removing soil layer by layer, treating the site with the respect it deserved. As midnight approached, his shovel struck something solid. Not the natural resistance of packed earth, but something with defined edges. Heart pounding, Thomas switched to a hand trowel and began to clear away the surrounding soil. Inch by inch, a box began to emerge from the earth. Not a casket as he had expected, but something smaller, about the size of a large suitcase. It appeared to be made of wood, the surface surprisingly well preserved after decades in the ground. Must be the clay soil, Thomas whispered to himself, recalling something he'd read about how certain soil conditions could preserve organic materials. Keeps out the oxygen. Working with painstaking care, Thomas cleared the soil from around the entire box. It had brass fixtures at the corners, now green with verdigris, and what appeared to be a small brass plate on the lid. As he brushed away the last of the dirt, Thomas could make out the initials LB engraved in flowing script, and beneath them, the date, 1923. Lucy Blackwood. Thomas sat back on his heels, suddenly aware that he was breathing heavily. This was it, confirmation of what he'd suspected. But now that the moment had come, he hesitated. Opening the box meant crossing a line. Once done, it couldn't be undone. For nearly an hour, Thomas simply sat beside the unearthed box, caught in his own moral struggle. The right thing would be to stop now, to call the authorities and let them handle whatever came next. But the need to know, to understand what had happened to Lucy Blackwood and why she had been buried here in secret, burned within him like a fever. "I'm sorry," he finally whispered, though he wasn't sure if he was addressing Lucy himself or some higher power that might be watching his transgression. "I need to know." With trembling hands, Thomas examined the box more closely. It was secured with a simple latch, no lock. The brass was corroded, but the mechanism still seemed intact. Taking a deep breath, he gently worked the latch free. The hinges creaked softly as he lifted the lid, revealing the contents at last. What he found inside wasn't what he expected. Not the remains of a small child, but something far more puzzling. The box contained a collection of items carefully arranged. A child's porcelain doll with a painted face, its dress yellowed with age but otherwise intact. Several photographs in small frames, the images faded but still visible. A solemn-faced man, a woman holding an infant, a family group standing stiffly in front of what Thomas recognized as his house in its earlier days. There was a small book bound in dark leather that felt oddly warm to the touch, its pages filled with handwritten text in faded ink. And at the center of these items, a wooden box about the size of his palm, sealed with dark red wax and bound with copper wire in intricate patterns. Thomas lifted one of the photographs, studying it in the harsh light. The family portrait showed the Blackwoods. He recognized Henry from his research, standing tall and stern in a formal suit. Beside him, a woman who must be Eleanor held a baby wrapped in an elaborate christening gown. But what caught Thomas's attention was the background. Behind the family, partially visible in a window of the house, was what appeared to be a face. Distorted, eyes too large, mouth stretched in an impossible smile. Thomas blinked and looked again. A trick of the light, surely, or damage to the old photograph. But a chill ran down his spine nonetheless. He set the photo down and picked up the small wooden box, turning it over in his hands. The wax seal bore an impression he didn't recognize. Not a family crest or religious symbol, but something more complex, with curved lines intersecting in a pattern that seemed to shift the longer he looked at it. Tomorrow, Thomas decided, he would take everything to a local historian, someone who could help him make sense of these objects and what they might mean. He carefully replaced each item in the larger box, except for the leather-bound book, which he slipped into his pocket. Whatever secrets the Blackwood family had buried in his yard, he suspected the answers might be written in those pages. As Thomas closed the lid of the box, a gust of wind extinguished one of his work lights, plunging half the yard into darkness. In the distance, thunder rumbled, a storm approaching. It was time to go inside. But as Thomas stood up, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. That by unearthing these objects, he had set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. And somewhere, just at the edge of hearing, he thought he could make out the sound of a child's laughter. Rain pounded against the windows as Thomas sat at his kitchen table, the leather-bound book open before him. The storm had blown in quickly as if summoned by his discovery in the yard. Now at nearly 3 a.m, lightning occasionally illuminated the room in stark flashes, followed by rumbles of thunder that seemed to make the old house groan, in response. Thomas had been trying to make sense of the book for hours. The handwriting was tight and cramped, written in faded brown ink that had seeped into the yellowed pages over the decades. Some entries were dated, spanning from 1922 to 1923, while others contained what appeared to be notes or observations without clear timestamps. June 12, 1922, Thomas read aloud, his finger tracing the words. Eleanor delivered a healthy girl today after a difficult labor. We have named her Lucy after our first. Dr. Patterson seemed concerned about Eleanor's fever, but I have prepared the tincture as instructed. The child has the birthmark, just as the old woman said she would. Perhaps there is truth to her claims after all. Thomas flipped forward several pages. August 3, 1922. Lucy grows stronger each day, though she rarely cries like other infants. Eleanor says she stares at things that aren't there, following movements in empty corners of the nursery. The old woman visited again today. She seemed pleased with Lucy's development, but warned that precautions must be taken before the winter solstice. I have begun collecting the necessary items. Thomas rubbed his tired eyes. The old woman was mentioned repeatedly throughout the entries, though never by name. She seemed to hold some influence over Henry Blackwood, providing guidance or instructions related to the child. As Thomas continued reading, the entries grew increasingly disturbing. October 15th, 1922. Lucy spoke today. Not the babbling of a normal child of her age, but clear, distinct words in a language I did not recognize. Eleanor was not present, thank God. When I approached the crib, Lucy smiled at me with an expression no infant should possess. The old woman says this is a sign that our efforts are succeeding, but I find myself questioning the path we have chosen. Thunder cracked directly overhead, making Thomas jump. He glanced nervously at the windows where rain streamed down the glass like tears. Outside, his yard was transformed into a muddy mess, the excavation site now a dark pool of water. The box, and its contents except for the book, remained in the hole. Thomas had intended to bring everything inside, but something had stopped him at the last moment. A sudden, inexplicable certainty that those objects should not cross the threshold of his home. Not yet. Not until he understood what he was dealing with. He turned back to the journal, flipping ahead to an entry from December 21st, 1922, winter solstice. The ritual was performed as instructed. Eleanor knows nothing of this. I told her I was attending a business meeting. The old woman brought 5 others with her. They wore robes of undyed wool and spoke little. We gathered in the woods beyond Miller's Creek, where the stones form a natural circle. Lucy remained silent throughout, watching everything with those unnatural eyes. When the moon reached its peak, they cut her palm and collected the blood in the carved box. She did not cry. Instead, she laughed, a sound that chilled me to my core. Thomas closed the book with a snap, suddenly feeling ill. What kind of father would involve his infant daughter in such things? And what exactly had the Blackwoods been involved in? He tried to rationalize what he was reading. Perhaps Henry Blackwood had been mentally unstable. Perhaps the journal was a work of fiction, not a record of actual events. But the box buried in his yard was real enough, and the items inside corresponded with what was described in the journal. Lightning flashed again, and in that brief, bright moment, Thomas thought he saw a shadow move across the kitchen wall. A small, child-sized silhouette that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Just my imagination, he muttered, but the hair on his arm stood on end. He opened the journal again, this time near the end, where the handwriting had grown more erratic, the words sometimes trailing off mid-sentence or crossed out violently. March 17, 1923. Lucy no longer sleeps. She stands in her crib all night staring at the wall, whispering. Eleanor has taken to sleeping in the guest room. She says she cannot bear the sound of Lucy's voice in the dark. The birthmark has grown, spreading across her back like ink in water. The old woman says this is expected, part of the transformation. But I fear we have opened a door that cannot be closed. Thomas turned to the final entry, dated April 3rd, 1923. It is done. God forgive me, but it is done. Lucy is gone, though what was inside her left its mark on this world. The old woman brought the special box, lined with silver and bound with copper, wire in the patterns she showed me. We gathered the items as instructed, objects of innocence, objects of connection. Eleanor's family portrait, the doll my mother gave to our first Lucy, and the record of everything that happened, which I write now with a heavy heart. The old woman says the box must be buried in consecrated ground, but the church refused once they suspected what had occurred. So we have made our own sacred space, in the far corner of our property where the oak tree stands sentinel. The concrete marker bears her initials and the date, though what lies beneath is not Lucy, not truly. It is merely the vessel, the anchor that binds it to this world but prevents it from walking freely. I have done a terrible thing in the name of grief and ambition. I sought to bring back what was lost, to undo death itself. Instead, I have condemned my family, and perhaps this very house. The old woman says the binding will hold as long as the box remains undisturbed. God help whoever might one day release what we have imprisoned there. The journal ended there. Thomas sat motionless at the table. The implications of what he had, read slowly sinking in. Henry Blackwood had done something to his daughter, or something involving his daughter, something he had come to regret. And whatever it was, it had been deliberately buried and sealed away in Thomas's backyard. And now, he had dug it up. A floorboard creaked overhead, a soft, deliberate sound like a footstep. Thomas froze, listening intently. He lived alone. There should be no one upstairs. Another creak, then another. Slow, measured steps moving across the ceiling directly above him. The path from the spare bedroom toward the stairs. Thomas's mouth went dry. He should call someone, the police, a friend, anyone. But what would he say? That he'd dug up a century-old box in his yard and now thought something was walking around his house? They'd think he was crazy or drunk or both. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. Thomas stared at the doorway that led from the kitchen to the front hall, his heart hammering so loudly he was sure it could be heard throughout the house. For a long moment, there was only silence broken by the steady drumming of rain on the roof. Then, so faint he almost missed it beneath the storm's noise, came a sound from the staircase, a small, light foot on the top step. Then another. Someone, something, was coming down the stairs. Thomas couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The journal lay forgotten on the table as he stared at the doorway, waiting for whatever was approaching to reveal itself. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs. A pause. Then the subtle sound of movement in the front hall coming closer, to the kitchen doorway. A flash of lightning illuminated the house, and in that split-second burst of brilliance, Thomas saw a small figure standing in the doorway. A child in an old-fashioned white dress, her face unnaturally pale, dark hair hanging limply around her shoulders. Where her eyes should have been were only empty, dark hollows. Darkness returned as the lightning faded, and Thomas sat paralyzed, unable to scream or run. The next flash came seconds later, revealing an empty doorway. Whatever he had seen, or thought he had seen, was gone. But a new sound filled the silence between thunderclaps, the soft patter of small, bare feet on the kitchen tile circling the table where he sat. Thomas fumbled for his phone, hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. The screen's glow provided just enough light to confirm he was alone in the room. At least that's what his eyes told him. But his ears insisted otherwise. The footsteps continued their slow circuit around him, occasionally stopping as if their owner was pausing to study him more closely. "Who's there?" Thomas finally managed to whisper, his voice cracking. The footsteps stopped. Then, directly beside his ear, came a child's voice, soft and sweet and terribly wrong. "You found me." Thomas leapt from his chair with a strangled cry, backing against the refrigerator. The journal fell to the floor with a heavy thud. There was nothing there, no child, no intruder. Just the empty kitchen, dimly lit by his phone's glow. But as he stood there, heart racing, a new certainty formed in his mind. Whatever Henry Blackwood had buried in that box, whatever he had tried to bind or contain, was now free. And it was in his house, aware of him, watching him. He needed help. Not the police or a friend, but someone who might understand what he was dealing with. The journal mentioned an old woman who had guided the Blackwoods through whatever ritual they had performed. Was she still alive? Unlikely after 100 years. But perhaps there was someone in town with similar knowledge. Someone who knew the old stories, the history that didn't make it into official records. As if in answer to his unspoken question, Thomas remembered something Ruth, the librarian, had said. The Blackwoods were well respected, but people said they kept to themselves, especially after she knew something, or suspected something, about the family's history. Tomorrow he would find Ruth and tell her everything. But first, he had to survive the night in a house that suddenly felt like it belonged to someone else. Morning came, with painful slowness. Thomas had spent the remainder of the night huddled on his living room couch, every light in the house blazing, the leather journal clutched to his chest like a shield. Each creak of the old house, each tap of tree branches against windows had sent his heart racing, but there had been no more footsteps, no more whispered words in the dark. As sunlight finally began to filter through the curtains, Thomas felt a wave of doubt wash over him. In the harsh light of day, last night's terror seemed almost ridiculous. Had he really seen a ghostly child in his kitchen doorway? Or had it been a combination of exhaustion, stress, and an overactive imagination fueled by the disturbing journal entries? Thomas rubbed his gritty eyes and looked down at the journal. That at least was real. The Blackwoods had lived in this house. They had buried something in the backyard, something they feared. And he had dug it up. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky scrubbed clean and blue. Thomas made himself a strong cup of coffee, then steeled himself to look out the kitchen window at the backyard. The excavation site was a mess, a water-filled hole surrounded by mud. The box he'd unearthed was no longer visible, likely submerged beneath the rainwater. Thomas's phone showed it was just past 7 in the morning. The library wouldn't open until 9, but he couldn't bear to remain in the house any longer. He showered quickly, changed into fresh clothes, and tucked the journal into a plastic bag to protect it from any lingering dampness. Within 20 minutes he was in his car driving toward town with no clear destination except away. He ended up at a small diner on Main Street, one of the few places open so early. The waitress, an older woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Dot, seemed to sense his distress. "Rough night, hun?" she asked as she poured his coffee. "You look like you haven't slept a wink." Thomas managed a weak smile. "That obvious?" "Huh? Seen that look before?" Dot said with a nod. "New in town, aren't you? You bought the old Blackwood place, right?" Thomas's hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. "You know about the house?" Dot shrugged. "Lived here all my life. My grandmother used to clean for the Blackwoods back in the day." She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. Strange folks, from what she said, kept to themselves mostly, especially after what happened with their little girl. Thomas's pulse quickened. "What happened to her? To Lucy?" Dot's eyes widened slightly. "Now how would you know that name? Most folks around here have forgotten all about the Blackwoods." "I've been doing some research," Thomas said carefully. "Found some old records." Dot studied him for a moment, then glanced around the nearly empty diner. Apparently satisfied they wouldn't be overheard, she slid into the booth across from him. "My grandmother didn't like to talk about it much. Said it wasn't right, what happened in that house. The way she told it, the Blackwoods lost their first baby girl, Lucy, to fever. Nearly broke them, especially the mother. Then years later they had another daughter and named her Lucy too, which folks thought was odd. Tempting fate, some said." She paused to sip from her own coffee cup. "The second Lucy was a strange child, according to my grandmother. Never cried, never played like normal kids, just watched everything with those big dark eyes of hers. And there was something wrong with her skin, a birthmark that kept growing. Folks in town started whispering. Then one day the Blackwoods announced the child had died suddenly. There was a small funeral at the church, but no one saw the body. Closed casket. After that, the family fell apart. The mother took to her bed, wouldn't see anyone. The father started drinking heavily. They lost their standing in the community, eventually sold the house and moved away. Thomas swallowed hard. Do you know anything about someone they might have consulted? An older woman who gave them advice? Dot's expression changed. A flicker of something, recognition perhaps, or concern, crossing her face. Now that's a name I haven't heard in a long time. They called her Widow Gray, though no one seemed to know if she'd ever actually been married. Lived in a cabin out by Miller's Creek. Some called her a witch, others a healer. Depended on whether you needed her help or not, I suppose. Is she still? Thomas began. Dot laughed, a short, sharp sound. Alive? Lord, no. This would have been 100 years ago, but her granddaughter still lives out that way. Follows the old ways, from what I hear. Keeps to herself mostly. Thomas leaned forward eagerly. Do you know her name? Or how I could find her? Dot gave him a long, searching look. What exactly have you gotten yourself mixed up in, young man? Thomas hesitated. How much could he safely tell this stranger? But there was something trustworthy about Dot, and he desperately needed allies. I found something buried in my backyard, he said finally. Something the Blackwoods put there. And I think I might have disturbed something I shouldn't have. Dot's face paled slightly. She glanced around again, then pulled a napkin toward her and scribbled something on it. Her name's Vivian Gray. Lives in the last house on Creek Road, about 5 miles out of town. Can't miss it. Got all sorts of wind chimes and garden art out front. She pushed the napkin with the address toward him. But listen to me carefully. If you've dug up what I think you have, you need to be careful how you approach her. Bring a gift, something from nature. And for heaven's sake, be respectful. Vivian doesn't suffer fools. Thomas nodded gratefully, tucking the napkin into his pocket. Thank you. Really. Don't thank me yet. Dot said grimly. Just be careful. Some things are buried for a reason. An hour later, Thomas was driving down a narrow country road lined with ancient oak trees. His passenger seat held a small pot of wildflowers he'd purchased from a roadside stand. Dot's suggested gift for Vivian Gray. Creek Road wound through increasingly dense woods until it finally dead-ended at a small clearing. Just as Dot had described, a small cabin stood there, its weathered wood almost silver with age. The front yard was a riot of eclectic decorations. Wind chimes made from shells, bones, and colored glass hung from every available branch. Handmade, sculptures of twisted wire and found objects dotted the wild garden, and everywhere Thomas noticed small bundles of dried herbs tied with red string. He parked beside an aging pickup truck and sat for a moment, gathering his courage. The leather journal seemed to grow heavier in his jacket pocket. Was he really about to consult someone who might be, what? A modern-day witch? But what choice did he have? Whatever was happening in his house, it went beyond anything he understood. As Thomas stepped out of his car, the wind chimes began to sing in a sudden breeze. The door of the cabin opened before he could knock, revealing a woman who appeared to be in her 60s with long silver hair pulled back in a braid and sharp eyes that seemed to look straight through him. You're the one who bought the Blackwood house, she said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. Been expecting someone to show up eventually, though I must say you've acted quicker than most would. Thomas blinked in surprise. You knew I would come? Vivian Gray smiled thinly. Let's just say trouble has a way of finding its way to my door, especially trouble that started with my grandmother. She nodded at the wildflowers in his hand. Those for me? Thomas handed them over wordlessly. Vivian examined the flowers, nodded once in approval, then stepped back from the doorway. Well, come in then. No point in having this conversation where the trees can hear it. The inside of the cabin was unexpected. Clean, bright, and surprisingly modern despite the rustic exterior. Bookshelves lined every wall, filled with volumes both ancient and new. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, filling the air with a complex, not unpleasant aroma. A sleek laptop sat open on a desk in the corner. Vivian set the flowers on a table and turned to face Thomas. "So, you dug it up." Thomas pulled the journal from his pocket. "I found this inside. It mentions your grandmother." Vivian's eyes fixed on the leather-bound book. "May I?" Thomas handed it over. Vivian held it for a moment without opening it, her eyes closed as if listening to something only she could hear. Then she nodded and placed it on the table. "Henry Blackwood's journal. I've heard about it but never seen it. My grandmother mentioned it before she died." She fixed Thomas with a penetrating stare. "Tell me exactly what happened. Everything you saw, everything you felt. Leave nothing out." For the next 20 minutes, Thomas recounted every detail, finding the grave marker, researching the Blackwoods, unearthing the box and its contents. He described the storm, reading the journal, the footsteps in the night, and the child's voice that had whispered to him. Throughout his story, Vivian listened without interruption, her expression grave. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then she sighed deeply. "The old stories are true, then. My grandmother never gave me all the details, said some things were better left unspoken. But she warned me that someday someone might disturb what she helped bury." "What exactly did they bury?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Vivian walked to a bookshelf and removed an old, leather-bound volume much like the journal, but larger. "What do you know about grief?" she asked, seemingly changing the subject. "Real grief. The kind that tears you apart from the inside?" Thomas began, then stopped. He thought of his divorce, the pain that had driven him to buy the old house and start over. But that seemed trivial compared to losing a child. "Henry and Eleanor Blackwood lost their daughter," Vivian continued. "Their first Lucy. It destroyed them, especially Eleanor. She couldn't accept it. And in their grief, they turned to my grandmother, who was known for her unconventional abilities." She opened the book in her hands, flipping through yellowed pages covered in handwritten text and strange diagrams. "They wanted their daughter back. And my grandmother, God help her, told them there might be a way, not resurrection. That's impossible. But there are spaces between worlds, things that want to cross over, things that need a vessel." Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "Are you saying they put something inside their second daughter?" Vivian looked up, her eyes hard. "I'm saying they made a deal they didn't understand. They thought they were getting their daughter back. Instead, they created a doorway for something else, something that wore their new child like a costume." She closed the book with a snap. "When they realized what they'd done, they turned to my grandmother again, this time to contain what they'd unleashed. She helped them create a binding box, a prison of sorts. The objects inside, their anchors, ties to this world that keep the entity bound but also confined. And now I've opened it," Thomas whispered. "Yes," Vivian said simply. "You have." The drive back to his house felt endless. Thomas gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, his mind racing with everything Vivian Gray had told him. "You have 3 days," she'd said as he was leaving. "Maybe 4. These things gain strength slowly at first, but once they have a foothold in our world, they grow powerful quickly. Already it's learning how to influence the physical world. The footsteps you heard, the voice. Soon it will be able to do much more." In the passenger seat lay a small cloth bag Vivian had given him, filled with dried herbs, small crystals, and other items he couldn't identify. Beside it was a piece of paper with detailed instructions written in her neat, precise handwriting. "This won't destroy it," she'd explained. "Nothing can. But if you follow these steps exactly, you can bind it again, create a new prison to replace the one you opened." The most important part, Vivian had stressed, was that Thomas needed to return everything to the box exactly as he had found it, plus one additional item, something personal, something that mattered to him. A sacrifice, she'd called it though. She'd been quick to add that it didn't need to be anything dramatic. Something you value, she'd said. The entity feeds on attachment. By giving up something you care about, you weaken its hold. As Thomas pulled into his driveway, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the front yard. His house looked the same as always. Old, slightly weathered, but ordinary. There was no visible sign of anything wrong, nothing to suggest that something not of this world was now dwelling within its walls. He sat in his car for several minutes, trying to gather the courage to go inside. Part of him wanted to drive away and never come back, to abandon the house and everything in it. But Vivian had been clear. The entity was now bound to him as much as to the house. He had opened the box, he had set it free, and only he could put it back. "You can do this," Thomas muttered to himself, grabbing the bag and paper from the passenger seat. "Just follow the instructions. Get everything back in the box. Redo the binding. Simple." But as he approached the front door, his steps slowed. The house seemed to be watching him, waiting. The windows reflected the setting sun like eyes glowing with inner fire. The key stuck in the lock for a moment, something that had never happened before, then suddenly turned easily. The door swung open with a long, low creak. Inside, the house was cold, much colder than it should have been. Thomas could see his breath misting in the air as he stepped into the front hall. The lights didn't respond when he flipped the switch. "Power outage," he said aloud, trying to convince himself there was a rational explanation. But the digital clock on the microwave was still glowing green in the kitchen. The power was working fine. Thomas pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating the dusty hardwood floor and the staircase leading to the second floor. Everything looked normal, yet felt wrong somehow, as if the dimensions of the rooms had subtly shifted when he wasn't looking. According to Vivian's instructions, the first step was to gather all the items from the box and bring them to a central location in the house. That meant going back out to the yard, to the water-filled hole where he'd left the box and most of its contents. As Thomas turned toward the back door, a child's laugh echoed from upstairs, high and sweet and terribly wrong. "It's trying to distract you," Vivian had warned, "to make you afraid. Fear gives it power. Whatever you hear, whatever you see, stay focused on what you need to do." Thomas took a deep breath and continued toward the back door. The laughter came, again followed by the sound of small running feet overhead. Something thumped on the floor above, as if a child had jumped or dropped a heavy toy. Outside, the backyard was a mess of mud and puddles. The hole he'd dug was now a small pond, dark water filling the rectangular depression. Thomas knelt at its edge, setting down the flashlight so its beam illuminated the murky water. He rolled up his sleeve and plunged his arm into the cold, silty water. His fingers scraped against something solid, the wooden box. It took several attempts, but finally he managed to grip its edge and drag it up through the mud and water. The box was heavier than he remembered, waterlogged and dripping. The brass fixtures were tarnished, almost black now, and the wood felt strangely warm despite the cold water. Thomas set it carefully on the ground beside him, then reached into the hole again, feeling around for the other items. The porcelain doll, the photographs, the small sealed wooden box. One by one, he recovered them, each object coated in mud that he carefully wiped away with the hem of his shirt. The doll was the worst. In the beam of the flashlight, its painted face seemed to shift expressions as he cleaned it, the cracked porcelain mouth appearing to smile when he wasn't looking directly at it. When Thomas had gathered everything, he carried it all back into the house. According to Vivian's instructions, he needed to place the items in a circle in the center of the main floor. The living room had the most open space, so he cleared away the coffee table and laid everything out on the worn area rug. The second step was to cleanse the space. Thomas opened Vivian's cloth bag and removed a bundle of dried herbs tied with red string. He lit it with a match as instructed, then walked slowly around the room, letting the fragrant smoke fill every corner. The herb bundle smoldered rather than burned, releasing a sharp, clean scent that somehow made the air feel lighter. As he completed the circle, A loud crash came from the kitchen, the sound of breaking glass. Thomas flinched but kept moving, remembering Vivian's warning not to be distracted. "It knows what you're doing," she'd said. "It will try to stop you." Next came the salt, a special mixture Vivian had prepared, black and pink crystals mixed with what looked like crushed herbs. Thomas carefully poured it in a circle around the items from the box, his hands shaking slightly as the house creaked and groaned around him. The temperature dropped further. Thomas could now see ice crystals forming on the windows, spreading in fern-like patterns across the glass. From upstairs came more noises, footsteps, scratching sounds, and occasionally that terrible childish laughter. With the circle complete, Thomas moved to the third step, the hardest one. He needed to read the binding words Vivian had written, down while holding the item he was sacrificing to strengthen the seal. He'd thought long and hard about what to use. It needed to be something with genuine emotional attachment. In the end, he'd chosen his grandfather's pocket watch, a family heirloom passed down through generations, one of the few items he'd kept after the divorce. It was solid gold, engraved, with his grandfather's initials, and it had always brought Thomas a sense of connection to his family's past. As he held the watch in one hand and Vivian's paper in the other, the noises from upstairs suddenly stopped. The silence was somehow worse than the sounds had been, a tense, waiting quiet that pressed against his ears. Thomas began to read the words Vivian had written. They weren't in English, or any language he recognized. The syllables felt strange, in his mouth, almost burning his tongue as he spoke them. Halfway through the first paragraph, the lights flickered violently. The circle of salt on the floor began to stir, as if disturbed by an unfelt breeze. The porcelain doll's head turned, just slightly, just enough for Thomas to notice from the corner of his eye. He kept reading, his voice growing stronger with each line. As he reached the final paragraph, a high, keening wail erupted from upstairs, not a child's voice anymore, but something ancient and full of rage. The windows rattled in their frames. Books flew from shelves. The temperature plunged so low that Thomas's fingers began to go numb, making it difficult to hold the paper. And then, at the edge of the salt circle, she appeared. She looked like a child at first glance, a small figure in a white dress, dark hair hanging limply around her face. But as she moved closer to the circle, Thomas could see she was something else entirely. Her movements were wrong, too fluid, as if her limbs had extra joints. Her skin seemed to shift and ripple beneath the surface, and her face, what he had taken for a pale complexion, was actually a complete absence of features. A smooth, blank canvas that somehow still conveyed furious, malevolent intent. "Mine now," the thing whispered, its voice coming from everywhere and nowhere. "This house, this world, mine." It reached toward the circle, and where its fingers touched the salt, black smoke curled upward. Thomas forced himself to keep reading, the final words tumbling from his lips as the creature shrieked and clawed at the barrier. As he spoke the last syllable, a shockwave seemed to pulse outward from the circle. The entity was thrown backward, its form flickering like a bad television signal. Thomas quickly placed his grandfather's watch in the center of the circle, alongside the other items. Then, following Vivian's instructions, he gathered everything, including the salt, and returned it all to the wooden box. The entity thrashed and wailed, its form becoming less substantial with each passing moment. As Thomas closed the lid of the box and secured the latch, it let out one final scream, a sound of such primal rage and frustration that the windows cracked in perfect spiderweb patterns. Then silence. Thomas sat on the floor beside the box, his heart pounding, his body drenched in cold sweat. Had it worked? Was the thing contained again? According to Vivian's final instructions, he needed to rebury the box before sunrise, with a new marker to replace the one he'd removed. Using concrete mix from the hardware store, Thomas created a crude slab similar to the original. While it dried, he dug a new hole in the same spot where he'd found the box, making it deeper this time. As the first light of dawn touched the eastern sky, Thomas placed the box in the hole and covered it with earth. He positioned the new concrete marker, on top having etched into it the same initials, LB, and the current year. The last step was to plant specific herbs around the burial site. Seeds and seedlings Vivian had provided in a small pot. Protection, she'd explained. A final barrier. Not foolproof, but it should help keep things contained. When it was done, Thomas stood back and looked at his handiwork. To a casual observer, it would appear to be nothing more than a small garden with a stepping stone. Only he knew the truth of what lay beneath. In the weeks that followed, the house gradually returned to normal. The strange cold dissipated. The noises stopped. Thomas found himself able to sleep through the night again, though he still sometimes woke suddenly, certain he'd heard a child's laughter fading down the hallway. He never told anyone else what had happened. Who would believe him? But he maintained the herb garden faithfully, following Vivian's instructions for its care. And he never, ever, disturbed the earth beneath it. Some things, Thomas had learned, are buried for a reason. Some discoveries are simply not meant to be made.